Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. As you can see, it is time again for another Star Trek review, and it's time for our first foray into a series that I have never covered on the show before, Deep Space Nine. DS9 for me was always the outlier of the Trek series. Allow me to explain. See, when I first got into Star Trek, it was back when Netflix was a thing, but it was before all the major studios had streaming deals. So for Star Trek, I kind of had to rely on whatever I could get my hands on, and a lot of that was reruns on TV, which is why I got into The Next Generation first. It was on BBC America. And then the TOS and TNG movies, because they would rerun on the movie channels. And then Voyager and Enterprise, and eventually the original series itself. But never Deep Space Nine, mainly because it was a pain in the ass to watch, since it wasn't on TV, at least on a channel I was aware of, and the only way that I'd found to watch it back then was through getting DVDs from Netflix, but even that was luck of the draw if the entire season was available, and back then I wanted to watch the whole thing. I saw the pilot episode at some point, but I felt that it wasn't really for me, and that was enough for me until years down the line I tracked down the Mirror Universe episodes because I, at that point, really liked the Mirror Universe, and I liked them well enough, and that was pretty much it. Until Star Trek Online released their Victory is Life expansion, and I found that I really liked those characters and wanted to watch their show. So I started at the beginning, but I couldn't really get into it. It wasn't bad, but all Trek shows have their growing pains, and I had trouble with it, so I skipped ahead a little bit to when Worf showed up, and that did the trick to get me hooked. Having watched everything from Season 4 until the series finale, and the documentary, with assorted episodes from the first 3 seasons, I can firmly say now that I really, really like the show, and I regret having not watched it earlier. The characters are wonderful. Sisko has become one of my favorite captains purely because he is one of the most humanized captains that Star Trek ever produced because he is so relatable, which is crazy considering his position on the show. And I think it actually ranks as my number 2 favorite Star Trek show ever, behind TNG, which is there because it's my first and holds a special place in my heart. But that lack of interest that I had that made me not watch DS9 until a couple years ago also never led to me reading any of the Deep Space Nine novels, because I didn't really know who the characters were or where to start, so I've decided to rectify that by checking out the Millennium trilogy, since at the time that I read it, I hadn't yet finished the series, and the trilogy takes place during the 6th season. Speaking of the backstory, I probably should address this since the book takes place essentially right before the end of the show, so there's a lot of backstory to get to this point, and if it took me this long to watch Deep Space Nine, I'm sure there are a bunch of you guys out there who don't know that much about the show, and I think you kind of need the backstory to understand the story. Why couldn't I have picked a book that took place during Season 1? Anyway, if you're not familiar with Deep Space Nine, here's the story. Commander Benjamin Sisko, following the loss of his wife at Wolf 359 and a few years working on designing what would later become the USS Defiant, is transferred to the frontier along with his son Jake to oversee the transition for the Bajoran people as the Cardassians withdraw from their 60-year occupation of the planet Bajor, as requested by the transitional government. Sisko is given command of Deep Space Nine, formerly Terok Nor, a Cardassian mining station built in orbit of Bajor. Assorted Starfleet personnel are brought in to get the station into working order, including Chief Miles O'Brien from the Enterprise D, later Lieutenant Commander Dax, a Trill and newest host of the Dax symbiont. The Trill symbiont bonds with the host, and so she contains multitudes, and Jadzia's predecessor, Curzon, was Sisko's mentor, and she has centuries of life experience to call upon, and Dr. Julian Bashir, a young egotistical doctor ecstatic to be working in the backwater frontier, who was later revealed to have been genetically engineered, but not Khan level. The station's second-in-command is Major Kira Nerys, a Bajoran former freedom fighter who doesn't quite like the idea of trading in one outsider species for another, even if Starfleet has good intentions, but she comes around to accepting Starfleet's presence. Rounding off the non-Starfleeters are Constable Odo, a changeling security officer who is constantly trying to find a good reason to arrest Quark, the Ferengi bartender, who employs his brother Rom and nephew Nog, the latter of which becomes fast friends with Jake Sisko. But the most important thing to note about the station is that after Sisko's arrival, they discover a wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant, which also houses the Prophets, who are the god figures of the Bajoran religion, and they choose Sisko as their emissary, adding in another wrinkle as Sisko has to wrestle with the fact that he's become a key religious figure basically overnight, especially being from the seemingly atheist Federation and what that entails. And like I said earlier, Worf, son of Moog, joins the station in the 4th season as their strategic operations officer in the wake of a war with a Gamma Quadrant power called the Dominion, who use clone soldiers called Jem'Hadar and are commanded by the Founders, members of Odo's species who wish to customarily dominate the galaxy.
Of course!
In addition, Nog joins Starfleet as a cadet and later ensign when the Dominion War heats up and loses a leg, and Rom quits his job at Quark's to become an engineer for the station working under Miles O'Brien. This is the tail end of Season 6, so I think that's all you need to know. Let's boldly go. Well, that's not quite right, since it takes place on a space station, so all the threats come to them. But that doesn't scan as well, so let's boldly go where many have gone before, since this series is apparently very highly regarded by Trek fans, and check out the first third of the Millennium trilogy. This is the fall of Terok Nor. So, full disclosure, I bought the book in single form because the 3 books form a special cover if you collect all 3, but I read the book as part of the Millennium Omnibus. On its own, the cover isn't really anything special. We've got a third of DS9 with Sisko floating in the void to the left of it, which actually tracks pretty well with how Sisko ends up at the end of the series, but I'll try very hard to limit spoilers. Otherwise, it features a red wormhole behind the station, the DS9 logo on the top, with Millennium underneath. Then at the bottom we can see that it's book 1 of 3, and it was written by Judith and Garfield reeves-stevens, who should be familiar names by now. They've written a fair share of their own solo Trek books, but also worked with William Shatner on Academy Collision Course, and all of his Shatner-verse books that we've previously covered on the show, which, speaking of, I probably should finish off that initial trilogy at some point. Anyway, it's not amazing, but it's still a decent cover, even if I like the Omnibus's cover more, since it's just a more exciting image. Anyway, on to the book itself. The story begins in space, although technically all stories take place in space because that's where the planets are, but I digress. The story opens up in the Celestial Temple, after the end of the series, with Sisko attempting to explain an experience in another timeline to the wormhole aliens, who have enough trouble as it is with linear time, so this will probably take a while. Then it flashes back to the day of the withdrawal after Gul Dukat, the former prefect, left the station but before Sisko and Starfleet showed up. The Cardassians, angry about being made to leave their station, are looting and pillaging whatever they can get their hands on, with some Cardassians targeting Quark for execution because, well, they're evil, and Quark isn't the most reputable business owner. Remember the song Master of the House from Les Mis? Quark's policies aren't that far off. However, Quark is rescued at the last minute by another Cardassian before fleeing back into his bar, where he finds Odo hiding out. Both Quark and Odo are captured by 3 additional Cardassians, one particularly noteworthy because he's bald, but instead of being killed, they're conscripted for some unknown task. As they're brought to a secret corridor of the station, they're observed by Garak. Noted by Quark before the leader of the Cardassians, a woman named Terok, shoots Odo and forces Quark to enter a room to retrieve something that apparently can't be retrieved by anyone without a Ferengi's brain, which in the past has been shown to be resistant to telepathy. The other Cardassians also capture Garak, whom Quark notes has changed clothes in between watching and getting caught, but that seems normal. After all, he is but a plain and simple tailor. After going inside, Quark sees a vision of his Moogie before we skip ahead to Quark waking up in a holding cell. 6 years later, of course. In the present, Quark is in a holding cell because he's in protective custody because an Andorian merchant, Dal Nortran, was killed via a blast of microwave radiation. Quark's the prime suspect, and the Andorian's partners, a pair of Andorian assassin sisters, want Quark dead. And Odo's having a bit too much fun with finally having Quark in one of his cells. Unfortunately, the investigation isn't going anywhere because the Andorian sisters have gone into hiding, and Odo legitimately believes that Quark committed the murder, wittingly or not, so he's not looking too hard into it. Meanwhile, while doing routine maintenance on the station, O'Brien and Rom stumble onto 2 Cardassian bodies hidden in a bulkhead from the time of the handover. But the interesting thing about it is that one of their outfits is a Garak original. Garak, if you're unaware, is just a simple tailor who runs a clothing shop on the promenade and was kinda sort of a member of the Obsidian Order in the past and probably went into tailoring so he'd always have a sharp object on hand. But Garak is clueless as he doesn't seem to remember making the outfit, relevant because both Quark and Odo are having trouble remembering the handover. Not that Odo or Garak are willing to admit it, but Quark is, and he rats out his Terok Nor colleagues. Sisko also grapples with the new Bajoran Starfleet officer, Arla Rees, who brushes up against Major Kira because Arla doesn't believe that the prophets are gods, seeing them as just aliens, and grew up on a colony world and not Bajor, meaning Major Kira doesn't see her the same as she sees herself, who had to fight to survive, which causes some issues. Sisko's not thrilled with her either, because her attitude is kind of like if your coworker was literally Jesus, and you still insisted that you were an atheist. In addition, Jake and Nog rediscover an old holosuite they found in the lower levels of the station back when they first met, and finally, nearly 7 years later, reveal its existence to Sisko, since it might be relevant in the investigation. And it turns out to not actually be a holosuite at all, but an old Cardassian lab. The same one that the Cardassians, led by Terrell, sent Quark into back during the handover to retrieve a special artifact. Eventually, it comes out that Quark was running an auction for possibly apocryphal Bajoran religious artifacts, the Red Orbs of Jalbador. I didn't go into it before, but the prophets, aka the wormhole aliens, would occasionally send down orbs to aid the Bajorans in religious experiences. The Orbs of Jalbador, though, however, were sent by the Pa Wraiths, which were the hell demons to the prophets' angels, to borrow imagery from Christianity to get the point across. Or, more accurately, Quark was selling a map to the first orb. Vying for the artifacts were a Ferengi with uncharacteristic hair named Base. Geez, Ferengi with hair and bald Cardassians? The writers definitely have a thing about hair. The aforementioned Andorians and Vash, previously known to the crew of DS9 from the episode Q-less, though she's now, unfortunately for us, sans Q, and who was previously Captain Picard's love interest in the episodes Captain's Holiday and Cupid, the former of which, coincidentally, featured Max Grodenchik as a Ferengi in his pre-ROM days. Quark is kidnapped by the Andorian sisters, who also sabotage the station's computers, and while Sisko attempts a rescue from the bowels of the station, they're both eventually rescued by Vash, who is playing her own long game to get the map, which ends with a Mexican standoff inside Quark's between Vash, the Andorian sisters, Base, and Morn, Quark's dependable regular who comes to Quark's rescue. Just kidding. It's Odo in disguise, but it's a funny image nonetheless. Base gets the upper hand above Vash and the sisters, but up against Odo, it's no contest. Now that they've got the map and the first orb, which Vash had come into possession of, but they still don't know where the map is pointing. But Thanks to that fake holosuite, though, Jake and Nog think they might be able to identify the location of the orb, since Jake recognizes the location the map is showing from it, which points Sisko to a formerly inhabited Bajoran moon, long since turned into a power station and rendered barren and inhospitable. However, since they just figured out the final piece of the puzzle to finding the orbs, that means it's time for the classic "I'll be taking that" moment. While all that other stuff was going on, Terrell and her entourage resurfaced, ostensibly on a mission of peace to reclaim their fallen comrades, the ones they found in the hull plating, but as they confront the senior staff in the holosuite depicting the Bajoran moon, using the Andorian's computer virus as cover, they reveal that they're actually also after the lost orbs, and that Terrell was researching them before the handover. That was what was inside the room that they needed Quark to get, leading Terrell and her cronies to lock up the main cast in a holosuite recreation of one of Odo's security cells, and they kidnap Sisko to use him to find the second lost orb on the barren, deadly moon, with Sisko managing to keep the orbs out of their hands just long enough for the rest of the cast to escape the holosuite with the help of Vic Fontaine, the holographic lounge singer who was a breakout character of the final 2 seasons and one of my favorite recurring characters. Swing, baby, swing! They even managed to save Sisko at the last second, and the final orb turns out to have been on the station the entire time, hidden inside a painting of a Tholian admiral, or possibly a lewd portrait of Tholian genitalia, no one's really certain. That gold Ducat had insisted be hung in Quark's, and somehow over the years, despite Quark wanting to get rid of it, never got around to it. And now, since they assembled the 3 MacGuffins, it means they unlock the secret stage. Unfortunately, the completion bonus is just an advanced copy of Star Trek Insurrection, so Sisko tries to pawn the orbs off onto Kai Wynn, the Pope of the Bajorans, who is usually all about taking sacred Bajoran artifacts for herself in the name of Bajor, since she's super jealous about Sisko being picked as emissary, and the fact that she's never had a religious experience with the orbs. But in this case, she doesn't actually believe that the red orbs of Jalbador are real, so she tells Sisko he can keep them for all she cares, which is ironic if you know what happens to her character at the end of the show. Through an accident, all 3 of the orbs are brought together, and they start to form a new wormhole inside of Quark's that starts to tear the station apart. Everyone seems to escape the station, but as Sisko and company head to the Defiant, they're not fast enough to escape the pull of the wormhole, and they're sucked into it. But they seem to escape mostly unscathed, although they find that the stars are wrong.
Who's been playing about with the stars? They're all in the wrong places.
They determine that they've time-traveled 25 years into the future year of 2400. Not really new territory for either Star Trek itself or even the DS9 crew, who've all done it before, some more than once, but they're soon confronted by the USS Opaka, named after the previous Kai and friend of Sisko, captained by Riker. Surprisingly, no, not that one. No, it's Thomas Riker, and now you know why I spent the whole video wearing my TNG-era uniform with my Deep Space Nine comm badge, instead of my new TNG film/Season 5 onwards Deep Space Nine uniform that I bought a month ago. It's because... Ow, right, those are real. It's a reference to the Season 3 episode where Thomas Riker appeared and was sent to a Cardassian prison for being a Maquis after stealing the Defiant. And given that they all forgot about him in the regular timeline, and he was apparently there during the Dominion War while Cardassia was taken over by the Dominion, there's at least one person who's better off in this alternate future. Sisko tries to limit their exposure and wants to find a way home immediately, but Thomas just tells Sisko that they're not going anywhere, with similar reasons as to why Picard didn't want to let the Enterprise C leave in yesterday's Enterprise, and when another Starfleet vessel shows up and fires on the Opaka, Thomas tells Sisko that the War of the Prophets is beginning, and he's gotta pick a side. Do they wear red hats, or do they wear blue hats in Fushal? As the novel ends on a heck of a cliffhanger. As the beginning of a trilogy, it's not really fair to judge the book based on if the ending is satisfying, because it's all set up for the next two, and I decided to, on purpose, keep myself blind and not continue reading the series until I finished writing this review, judging it strictly on its own merit, mainly because I think doing all three at once is a little too ambitious for me. But I feel like the book is fairly satisfying as is, and then you throw in the alternate bad future with Thomas Riker at the end, and you've got me hooked and very excited for what's going to happen next. But that also makes it a tad uneven, given that while there's a quest of sorts that is completed by the end, there are a plethora of unanswered questions, and even the parts of a whole need to be able to stand on their own, especially given that the book clocks in at 409 pages. If the other books have comparable page lengths, which they do, I checked, that means that in total, the story as a whole is 1,200 pages long. So the individual thirds should leave me wanting more, but also be self-contained, because this is a pretty big time commitment on its own, even for someone who used to be able to knock out a 300-page book in a day. And I'd say that it mostly succeeds, even if I have some issues. I will say that the characters are a bit iffy. They're written like the characters on the show, but it's like how sometimes on TOS or TNG, depending on the writer, the characters would regress, like Data doing stupid android tricks despite having things explained to him dozens of times, or inconsistent character backstories. And Deep Space Nine didn't really suffer from that in-show because it was much more serialized, so they had to remember things that happened earlier and factor it in. Moments like never addressing that Laz had the morphogenic virus, or figuring it out chronologically when Odo was actually given the virus between his joining with the Link and subsequent force solidification, notwithstanding, the characters were almost always growing. But here, the characters feel almost regressed. Like, Kira is a lot more prickly, more like how she was in the early seasons, and Jake seems a lot more childish, despite him and Nog having grown into mature young adults by this point. And Sisko kind of brushes Jake off like he's a little kid trying to hang out with the grown-ups, despite Jake and Sisko's relationship having evolved by this point. It doesn't ruin the experience by any means, but it's noticeable, especially if you're an avid watcher of the show, since you know how the characters behave and grew over time, especially this late into the series. I will say that Odo feels off most of all. His insistence on keeping Quark locked up feels particularly mean-spirited, which gels with early Odo, but by this point I feel like Quark and Odo had a mutual respect, and instead of the usual comedy that comes from the Quark-Odo interactions, I actually feel really bad for Quark here. Odo at one point states that naturally he knows that Quark didn't commit the murder on purpose, but feels that Quark caused the death accidentally, and that doesn't sit right with me at all. It's not as noticeable with Kira, since her anger mostly comes out when discussing religious matters and matters involving Cardassians, which is consistent for her character up until the end, but she is still much more abrasive than she should be. That being said, there are some really good character moments. During the clandestine attempts to locate Quark after his kidnapping, O'Brien and Arla Reeves are alone on the Defiant together, and they have a long chat about the Prophets. To build on what I mentioned earlier, Reeves was raised off Bajor and is essentially an atheist, believing that the Prophet's influence has set Bajor back centuries and allowed the planet to be raised by the Cardassians, since the vast majority of Bajorans believe that it's all part of the Prophet's plan. Reeves is a very interesting character. We never really saw a-religious Bajorans on the show, because it was either Bajorans that believed in the Prophets or Bajorans that believed in the Pah-wraiths, and there weren't really any Bajorans that weren't into the religion stuff. But someone like Reeves, recognizing the issues with the Prophet's influence, is a nice way to shine a light on the entire situation in a way that wouldn't usually be conducive if it was on the show itself, since there's more room for that conversation to take place in a novel than there would be on the screen. And, compared to many book-exclusive characters I could name, Talana, Arlarise, while being abrasive, comes off as a reasonable person disconnected from the usual Bajoran rhetoric. And like I said, the standoff in Quarks, where for a minute they legitimately had me going for a second, thinking that Morin was gonna get in on the fight scene, was awesome. And while the narrative is fairly light on the Worf stuff, there is a good scene of Worf and Jadzia in the holodeck reenacting a famous Klingon battle where Worf is playing Kang, who was a friend of Curzon's, and leads to a humorous parody of Lloyd Benson's comment to Dan Quayle of,
"I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy."
"I knew Kang. Kang was a friend of mine. And you are no Kang." Which, for a relevant pop culture stab, is surprisingly well done, and doesn't feel dated because it feels perfectly in character for Jadzia to say. And while Worf and Jadzia discuss the Northrend case during that holodeck interaction, there's a funny line stating that a microwave is so primitive that it's almost like
endeavoring man to construct a mnemonic memory circuit using stone knives and bearskins.
Which got a chuckle out of me, and points to this writing duo for getting the quote right, unlike Marshak and Colbreath back in Triangle. We also never find out who killed Dal Northrend before jumping into the time travel story, and I figure that's because, given the time travel shenanigans involved, it's part of the conclusion to the story. But the fact that the death was pretty much dropped 2/3 of the way through the book once the standoff for the map happens is pretty unsatisfying, especially because the Dal Northrend story isn't all that compelling to me, since we don't know who he is, and his relation to the story at large is pretty tenuous at best. Obviously, I'm not saying that it had to be someone we knew, like Vash, but I wish that maybe we'd flashed back in this novel to actually see Dal Northrend as a character before his death, because otherwise, I don't feel the book does enough to really make me care outside of wanting to know who the real killer is, so Quark will be exonerated. Maybe I'll be given that at some point in the trilogy, but it's not there now. And this is a minor nitpick, but it's actually pretty noticeable that Worf wasn't a part of the major action, nor was he trapped in the holosuite with the others. On the one hand, yeah, you need someone on the outside, but notice that the book's major focus is on the DS9 exclusive characters, the ones who have been there since the first season. It's not a problem per se, but by this point, Worf was a valued member of the cast and was actually treated better here than he ever was on The Next Generation in some regards, so his lack of inclusion is pretty glaring to me as a fan of Worf. Makes me wonder if the book was initially pitched before Worf joined the cast, and those early Season 4 episodes, they had to shove Worf into the narrative somehow. That being said, only one character is truly absent, and that's Gul Dukat, who is practically a member of the main cast, despite being a guest star, but that's likely because his next major in-canon appearance would be immediately following the restoration of the timeline, so there's not much room for him, and I understand the lack of inclusion, disappointing as it may be. I think it also handles the callbacks fairly well. Lots of other Trek books, and even Trek TV shows and movies, have failed to make non-intrusive nods to the past of the show, but I think the reeves-stevens succeeded here. We get Vash, but she doesn't become an overpowering presence in the story, overshadowing the characters we're here to see. It's a nod, like seeing an old friend but having nothing to say, so you just, The Fall of Terok Nor is a decent setup, but a middling novel when read in a vacuum. Not surprising, given that there are 2 more decently sized novels left. Characters are iffy, and the pacing is a bit off, since everything at the end happens really fast, since I'm pretty sure you're meant to go straight into the next book. But it's just good enough that I figure that once I have the entire trilogy under my belt, I will probably reevaluate my findings here, and the story as a whole is probably very satisfying. I've never been disappointed by the reeves-stevens yet, and I doubt I'll be disappointed here. It is a little convoluted and scattered, especially with how the story jumps around. It starts as a murder mystery and then a kidnapping with several parties involved, and there's a whole subplot with Vash I didn't even touch on because it wasn't super relevant, and I felt the summary was getting too long. And then that's all completely forgotten when the Cardassians join the search for the orbs, and then the story just ends as it's getting interesting. And there are a lot of flashbacks that muddle the linear narrative slightly, but I still like the story enough that I can overlook my admittedly minor gripes and say that I definitely recommend the book as someone who adores Deep Space Nine. Not as much as I recommend other Trek books, but highly enough that I definitely think you should give it a chance. Just be prepared that it's not going to answer all your questions immediately, and some of the characters are weirdly regressed. But I'm definitely excited to see what direction the story goes in after this, given the ending, and I look forward to getting my questions answered at some point in the future. But knowing how I usually handle trilogies, don't hold your breath waiting for the next book to be reviewed here. But I'll be back with another video soon, however. See you next time. Do you think we can do this before it Fuck! Oh, God, it can't even last a full hour anymore. That's... Okay. Rounding off the non-Starfleeters are Constable Odo, a changeling security officer who is constantly trying to find a good reason to arrest